Hi guys, Olive here. Sorry about the crazy delay on this wrap up in TBR. April was not a good reading month for me at all. I had a lot of things going on, and to top it all off, I was experiencing the dreaded reading slump. Thankfully though, audiobooks and graphic novels kind of saved my month, so I at least have something to talk about. I also finished a few things in the very early days of May that I'm just going to tag on to April because it's my reading life and it's my choice. The first book I finished was It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway by David Satter. I've talked about this book quite enough. If you're interested in it, you can look in some of my past wrap-ups and TBRs because this took me a very long time to read, but it was very interesting and I gave it 4 stars. I then listened to on audiobook Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters. This book was about a 3.5 star rating for me. I took it down to 3 stars for Goodreads because it did drag on a little bit, but overall this was a very, very interesting listen. This book follows a woman named Nancy, or should I say she's more of a girl when the book starts. She becomes enamored with a stage performer named Kitty Butler and develops a relationship with her and eventually follows her to London and then joins them on the act and things progress from there. It was a really great story. I also watched the BBC adaptation of this book, which stayed pretty faithful to the film version up until the end, which did alter it a little bit just for entertainment's sake. The book was really great. The adaptation was very entertaining, so I enjoyed it. Then I read the second volume of Chew. I can't say too much about this one without giving away what happens in the first volume, but it continues to be really, really good and crazy with all the stuff that happens. I read the second volume of Ms. Marvel, which is called Generation Y, and this was absolutely fabulous. Again, can't say too much without giving away major things from the first volume. Then I read Lumberjanes. This is the first volume. This was highly recommended by a lot of people over at Book Riot, so I had to take a look. This is about a group of campers at a summer camp, and they're just an awesome group of girls who all have really cool personalities, and they start having adventures and supernatural things take place. And Ripley, who is the youngest, and this girl right here in the orange shirt, is hysterically funny. This was a great read now that the months are getting hotter and hotter, and it definitely has the summery vibe to it. I would highly recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. My favorite book of April was one that I listened to an audiobook, and that was The Interestings by Meg Wolitzer. Going into this book, I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it because it doesn't have the greatest reviews on Goodreads, which I seem to trust a little bit too much. This is probably going to turn out to be one of my favorite books of all time. I was so completely enraptured by the audiobook experience. I fell in love with these characters. This book follows 6 teenagers that meet at a creative or artsy summer camp. You follow them through a very good portion of their life, up from the time you meet them where they're about 15 or 16 years old up until when they're in their 50s. You see how some of them remain friends, some of them follow different paths. This book talks about how envy can affect friendships, how people can grow apart or closer together over the years. Sometimes you read a book at kind of exactly the right time in your life and it speaks to you in a way that it wouldn't have before. I think that's something really special about rereading, which I definitely want to reread this later in my life to see if I react the same way to it. But I am going through a lot of changes in my life right now. My friends from high school and college are also growing up and moving on into adult life, and everyone's taking a really different path. So it's really interesting for me to think about how my friendships with these people will evolve in positive or negative ways. I feel like I'm not explaining this well, but this book just completely spoke to the fears and the excitement I have about the future. This book kept me interested right up into the very last moment. It brought me to tears, which a book has not done. I can't even remember the last time that's happened. I don't know that this book would be for everyone, but this was totally the right moment for me to read it. I would recommend it. It was just really great. These next two were books that I technically finished in May, but since it was so early in the month, I'm just tacking them on to April. Because I love The Interesting so much, I immediately went to the library and picked up another by Meg Wolitzer, which is The Wife. This is a very short book, but it talks about a woman who decides to leave her husband while they're on a flight to Helsinki, where her husband, a famous novelist, is going to accept a very major literary award. This book shows a dark side to marriage in that it speaks to how women sometimes can be asked to give up a lot of themselves to be wives, mothers, caretakers in general, and what is lost when they accept those roles. The language in this book is so intensely powerful because of the amount of resentment the main character feels towards her husband and towards really society for asking her to give up so much of herself and what she wants in order to be a good wife and a good mother. It was really powerful and makes a really strong statement. You can fly through it really quickly. I definitely would recommend it. 4 stars. The next book I listened to an audiobook, and that was The Romanoff Sisters by Helen Rappaport. This book talks about the 4 daughters of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. This was a really great portrait of the Grand Duchesses. You learn a lot about their interests, what their relationship was like with their parents, of course their personalities. It was very sad because, of course, we know what happened to them. They were all murdered by the Bolsheviks. You really saw how doomed the family of Nicholas II was almost from the moment that Nicholas got married and then very quickly ascended to the throne. This book doesn't give a whole lot of information on the period in which they lived. You won't hear much about the political situation or the revolution in terms of in-depth information, which I think takes away a little bit from the book, although I know you can't include everything. Reading this book after having read another book on that time period and about the revolution and the things preceding it, I think would be really helpful in seeing just how detached and ignorant this family was. Nicholas and Alexandra completely closed off their family to the outside world and became a closed unit, specifically after Alexei, the heir to the throne, was born, because he had hemophilia and his life was always in jeopardy. There was this dramatic political situation brewing, and they did little to nothing to quell that situation, and in fact, much of what they did made the situation worse. So I think if you had a knowledge of that going into this book as I did, it would really contribute to your experience. Of course, you can read it or listen to it without having that knowledge, but I really think it enhances the experience just to see how closed off they were. There were 2 books I was reading that I just had to put down because they weren't compelling me to read them. As I said, I've had a little bit of a reading slump this month, so I really needed to be picking up things that were keeping my interest. Now that I'm more back on track, I might pick them back up this month. These books were The Lost Boys Symphony by Mark Andrew Ferguson and A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I'm reading a few books right now, the first of which is Egg and Spoon by Gregory Maguire. This is a YA title that takes place in Tsarist Russia, and it's about a young girl whose family is absolutely destitute, living in rural Russia, and she is called upon to take a train to St. Petersburg to meet the Tsar. So it's a nice little fantasy tale, and I thought something a little bit more palatable would help me bring me out of my slump, and I'm enjoying this one so far. Another book I'm reading is called The Bellwether Revivals by Benjamin Wood. I read a book that seemed kind of similar to this last summer that I absolutely loved. A little bit of a summery but also gothic type book, which I thought would absolutely pull me out of my slump. This takes place in Cambridge, and I think there are some murders that happen and a little bit of mystery, and I think there's also a strong musical element to this book, which really has me interested, so I'm very excited to keep going. The book I'm listening to on audiobook, that I happen to have a hard copy of as well, is The Marriage Plot by Jeffrey Eugenides. And this takes place at Brown University in Rhode Island. It follows a girl named Madeline, and she's just getting ready to graduate at the beginning of the book. and she's completely in love with a guy named Leonard, but there is a little bit of a split that happens there. And meanwhile, there is a very close friend of hers named Mitchell who believes he is destined to marry her even though she's in love with somebody else. So I'm only about a quarter of the way into this so far. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about it. I wanted to pick this up because I loved The Interesting so much, and this seemed to have some similarities, and it's also a more contemporary piece of literary fiction. But it's kind of pretentious. It takes place in an academic world, and there's lofty academic language, and I can't even say I particularly liked that stuff when I was a college student. The story has me interested enough, and I am definitely willing to keep listening, but I definitely don't think I'm going to like it as much as I like The Interesting. The next book I'm going to listen to on audiobook once I am done with the marriage plot is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This will be my first Austen novel. I thought it would be great to listen to now that it's spring, even though it feels like summer already. I have been meaning to listen to or read a Jane Austen book forever. I am so upset that it's taken me this long, but I thought it would be a really good time to read one. And I read through Book Riot's Start Here collection that Sense and Sensibility was the best place to start with Jane Austen, so that's what I'm gonna do. There are 2 other books that I might get around to. I'm not gonna put too much pressure on myself because I'm just slowly starting to ease myself out of this slump. But the 2 books I may get around to reading are The Golem and the Jinny by Helene Wecker, which I talked about in my last wrap-up in TBR. And then also I Captured the Castle by Dodie Smith, which is another YA book that follows a young girl and her descriptions of and adventures in a castle. And I thought this one would also be really good for spring. So yes, April wasn't a fabulous month for me reading-wise, but now that things are kind of falling into place in terms of my life, I am hoping that will change for May. If you've read any of these books or have any comments, please feel free to leave a comment below. You can find me on both Twitter and Instagram, both places at @abookolive, and the link to my Goodreads is down below if you would like to be friends. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye.